Now, I understand it's been a while since my last video.
Oh, fuck.
And during that time, a lot has happened. Fuck me, this stupid piece of shit. See, I've actually fixed up some of the paint issues here. Though, in attempts of trying to make it perfect, I've kind of bitten off more than I can chew.
Oh, I'm gonna fucking murder someone.
So, with all that being said, what has been the state of these two bikes since my last posted video? Well... Now, I do have a problem here, that being this giant gaping hole. Not the fun kind. With that, I've got some epoxy metal putty. I'm going to essentially fix the hole up here, so I have to change the whole crankcase over and deal with that mess. Now, there's no way of getting a roadworthy with a big hole in my crankcase. Now, I put a temporary bolt in the case mount so that I could put a putty over it without filling in the hole. So I did give the instructions a brief read, and all I needed to do was cut off whatever I needed in place to make it more pliable before applying onto whatever surface I needed to fix. Now with the putty cured, I could just have to sand it down to line up with the surface as well as the case itself. Admittedly not my best work.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Now we had to get the scratches out of the muffler cover. Now I did start off with higher grit, which wasn't really working to remove the deeper grooves. I employed the method to use lower grit to remove the deeper grooves, and then higher grit to smooth out the rest of the surface. Alright, I'm getting a little bit more impatient with how this is turning out. So this is some other sandpaper that I've got, which is it's the more heavy duty shit. This is 40 grit. This will literally tear hairs from your arm. I've also got rid of some of the paint coating here, which I'm going to fix up later, but that's future me problem. Fuck him. Yes, at this point it was just a rinse and repeat process trying to get a nice consistent surface that I can then polish later on. Now I don't actually have an orbital sander or polisher, so I'm going to have to come back to this. So I decided to tackle the curb rash on the front rim, filling in any of the holes with that putty. Obviously this process did create a lot of mess as well. Next was to fix up the crankcase cover that I got, which unfortunately had a lot of curb rash, so I used some of that putty to then fill in the gaps and then sand it down to provide a nice smooth surface. After that, it was time for priming. Old mate at the paint shop told me this trick to waterboard your spray cans in order to have a consistent spray pattern for whatever you are spraying onto. And quick tip, I'd always recommend you check that the paint matches the surface you are painting onto. But before I go into more detail about that, I decided to then cover up the crankcase so I don't overspray onto the rest of the bike. And with all that, I could start to then prime the crankcase. I have given this a first base coat, likely going to have to sand over and go over the blemishes and maybe areas where I didn't do a good enough job. But that's usually painting in a nutshell.
A few moments later.
And after a couple rounds, I managed to settle on this. And with that, I went on to painting. And remember how I mentioned to check what paint you're using before you start painting? Now that was a rookie error, I'll admit, but this time I got the right paint and the surface was looking much better. I even fixed up the surface here, so I'm going to call that a win. Now the front mudguard didn't look much better, in fact it looked even worse. Now I needed to give the surface a sand down to make sure that the surface was nice and even, relatively speaking. And since the surface is so uneven, even after sanding, I had to use some plastic filler to fill in the gaps. Now I had to strong arm the container into even opening itself. So after some more light reading, all I needed to do was take out however much I needed, mix it with a hardening agent, give it a bit of a thorough mix, and then apply to whatever surface I needed filling. I did need to use a couple rounds of filler to plug in any holes, as well as then create a nice consistent surface that I can then prime and paint on. I then had to sand again to smooth out the surface a bit more. Now the front mudguard is a real piece of shit to take off, so rather than doing that, I employ the method of covering everything else up. Now, using the tape as I did, it left a hard line, especially when I was building up with multiple layers of paint. So I had to then sand it all back again to blend in the surface, before then going for another round of paint. This was a very long night ahead of me.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later.
The mudguard at this stage was about 90% done. I still needed to come back to fix the orange peel issue, but that's a later me problem. Now the tail fairings also were damaged, some of the mounting points were broken off, so I had to plastic weld them into place, which involved melting the plastic and then affixing a melted staple in between the two surfaces I was adhering it to. Now I don't have a plastic welding gun, so I'm just using a soldering iron in heating up the staples and then driving them inside to the plastic. I also forgot I needed to attach the crankcase cover now since I finished painting it. Ow. I still have many things to do, which is going to comprise of this entire fucking episode. Now the process is more or less just sanding, cleaning, priming, and painting, so I'm going to skip all that and just show you me putting the tailpiece fairings back on. Very poorly, that is. Now I have to do that all over again for the Kawasaki, and since this is a sport bike, there are a lot more fairings. Yeah, no need to be careful, it's not like they don't cost a couple $100 each. Absolute dickhead. So now here I am back at it, breathing in more carcinogenic plastic fumes again. Now the tail fairings around the key barrel had some plastic broken off from it when someone tried to jimmy the lock that time, so I managed to recover some of those pieces and plastic weld them together. It involved just as the usual staple and melting plastic combo, but I was missing some pieces however, so I had to get a little creative. So I made my own. Well, that was easy. It was then fine-tuning that shape to making sure it fit in nice and snug, before then plastic welding it onto the rest of the broken pieces. Now sanding the surface exposed a lot of these staples and welds that I did previously, which is fine because I was going to fill it anyway to then create a nice smooth consistent surface so I can paint it. So with that all sorted, I then taped up the stickers, which was a very long and arduous process to... So I followed it with a sand, wiping it down, jerking my can, and spraying it all over. And after that load, I decided to go over it with some candy plasma blue. Now I figured you'd be pretty bored with me just jerking my can, so let's go with putting this bike back together now. That's not the right one. Shit. cheap bastard over here, so I decided to fix the floppy indicator instead of buying a new set. So I decided to wrap some tape around it and sandwich in some zip ties for some structural support, as well as then giving it a bit of a glue job.
Get in there nice and deep like.
Last step was to get the mirrors sorted, since there was a lot of flaking paint on the mount as well as the mirror stems themselves. And before painting, as usual, you always have to sand things down, which is always a fun task.
Bullshit!
I then had to construct this little box so I can then put the little mirror mounts on and not paint over the threads. So now the plan is just to let this all dry and should be all good to go.
A few moments later.
Now, you know how when you paint, it adds a level of thickness to the surface area? I may have gone a little impatient for this one, however. Now, one hop and skip overlay to eBay, I acquired some universal mirrors that will fit the Kawasaki. Shit. So, one little fishing expedition later, I acquired the mount that I dropped. That's one done. Surprisingly, took a lot longer to install than it should have. So now it's got to do with the broken one. Fuck me, this stupid piece of shit. And during the kerfuffle, I managed to lose my Allen key set, so I was scouring the workshop looking for it. For some reason I thought it might be in the bike, considering I was dropping nearly everything inside it today.
Oh, I'm gonna fucking murder someone.
This is oh, I left in here.
You stupid idiot.
And with all that sorted, I managed to fix the mirrors onto the bike. Now, I'd be lying if I had said that these mirrors were easy enough to install. But they work, there's no paint flakes, I think we're looking good. Now overall, I think these mirrors turned out quite well. So after all that, now my next step is to bleed the brakes. So I had to locate the bleeder nipple and just take that little thing off. Connect the hose up to the bleeder nipple so I can push out the old fluid. Now I consulted the service manual and DOT4 was the correct fluid to use. Now, I needed to take the old fluid out, so I put some toweling around to protect any of the other parts around the reservoir. And then attempted to drain the fluid with the big dumb syringe I bought offline. I then topped it off with fluid to make sure that we don't let air inside the system. Now, I was pumping pressure through the rear brakes by actuating the brake pedals so then I could push the old fluid out through the calipers. Now, I was struggling to bleed all the fluid towards the end. No matter how much I cranked the brake pedal, nothing was coming out. And during my investigation, trying to troubleshoot the issue, I ended up just dropping a bunch of fluid.
Oh, fuck.
Now, there was a fair bit of mess I made when trying to bleed this brake here. I did have to take out that silicone cup, or the silicone mold, which you can see in the waste bin I've got over there. So that was my mistake. I just need to fill the fluid into that reservoir without that mold in. And then I should be able to bleed the brakes no issue. So after figuring that out, it was actually pretty easy then to bleed the brakes. So I just put everything back into a place, topping up with fresh fluid, before realizing I put too much in. And then of course, putting all the rest of the parts back together before screwing it all down. And admiring the mess I made from just bleeding the rear brakes. Now the exhaust has a lot of curb rash as well as rust on the chrome, so I decided to take it all off so I could then reprime, repaint, and then fix it back into place. There we go. I gave the swing arm a bit of a clean since I made a mess beforehand, and just noting down how disgusting these parts all look. Which means I have to sand it all into place, which is not something I'm looking forward to. Now, after painting it, for it to cure, I need to turn the bike on and let it run for about 30 minutes. I'm gonna admit here, I did not leave it running for 30 minutes. Now that the muffler is now cured and secured properly, we can now put it back in place. And with that, the muffler is now fitted on. Though perhaps maybe I'll go around and tighten the bolts just for security. And here I managed to snap off the bolt. So I'm going to wait till this cures so I can drill it in and re-tap it. I also managed to break off another bolt here, which is not good as well, because it means I'm going to have to take that part off again. Now moving away from that headache, I decided it was time to polish the bike. Now the recommendation to remove the orange peel is to sand with 2000 to 3000 grit sandpaper, before of course polishing it all up. Now it was time to polish the bike up.
A few moments later.
Unfortunately I didn't get this on film, but after trying to shake this I broke the bottom of the polishing compound. So Mike, if you're watching this, I owe you some polishing compound. So already I was off to a bad start. That being said, I still decided to polish the bike considering the compound bottle was broken and I only had a limited amount of time before it dried up. However, it was at this point I think I started realizing I made a mistake here. Now I have sanded off most of that clear coat that basically was getting burnt through the polisher. And I'm gonna probably have to figure out a strategy of what I do next with this, because the two paints on the panels here aren't matching, as this one is more faded underneath the base coat that obviously I didn't do a good enough job of painting, whereas that I'm worried will not fare up with this. So I might have to call it. Now I think we're gonna wrap it up for today. I've made enough mistakes to perhaps question my life choices, so before I make any more problems for myself, I'm going to stop myself. And while I've got most of the things done for each respective bike, there are still things that need to be done. I still need to perhaps retweak and figure out a couple things, as well as install some bar ends since the ones I installed before broke off. And I think with all things considering, with how much I made a blunder with the paintwork and polishing up job here, plus this minor fuck up. However, there is also a problem inside here, that being the valve clearance issue. See, I noticed a ticking noise when I allegedly took this bike on the road, and that ticking noise is indicative of valve clearances being out of their respective tolerances, which means I have to then of course take the top of the engine off, check the cam tensioner to see if that's perhaps going to be an issue, or whether it is just adding a couple more discs, spans, discs, things, whatever it may be, inside here to ensure that those valves aren't hitting the piston head when it's going up. That's going to be its own respective job to do. Now I feel like the next videos for these bikes will be done individually as opposed to a group together. And also I need to get this one sorted, which I've already made some progress with. So about that bike. Got you there, didn't I, you dumb bastard? But in all seriousness, that video will probably likely be coming in the near future. And when I say near future, that could be anywhere from 6 to 12 months from now, just depending on how much I procrastinate. So, with all that being said, catch you around.